let's look at the T lymphocytes a little bit more specific, or the T cells. And in here, we're going to talk about a little bit more about their educational phase. Okay, remember we said they go to the thymus to be educated. Well, this process is known as selection and differentiation. So that's just the fancy word for the education. So this is education. Okay, so that's what we're looking at on this one. So when we're looking at both B cells and T cells, for that matter, they both originate in the bone marrow. And at this point, they pick a receptor. So your first step, and this part is a little bit review of what we did. So step one is pick a receptor. Let me actually spell that correctly. Okay, so for B cells, that will be a BCR. T cell, that's going to be a TCR. Okay, so those are your receptors that we are looking at. Now, specifically regarding the T cells, they don't just get a TCR, the T cell receptor, and that one is a receptor that is very specific to a certain antigen. Okay, very, very specific. So in addition to the TCR, they also get two other receptors. They get a receptor called CD4 and another one called CD8. Now, we'll come back to this at the very end of this one, so kind of put those in the back of your head because those are going to be relevant. At this point, they will now go to the selection process. They're going to go to school to be educated. So the T cells go to, if you can recall, that's going to be the thymus. So now we're going to start step two. So that's going to selection phase. And for T cells, that's going to be the thymus. Now the T cell here, okay, so this is T cell, which is a naive T cell, and it has a receptor on it. So let me do a couple different colors here. So let me do a receptor. I'm trying to remember what we did on the receptors before. I think we did this, and let me do this, and let me do self, and let me just do a viral one here, just something like that. Okay, so those are naive. This is called a thymocyte. It's immunoincompetent, or it's a naive T cell. So they go to the thymus for education to become a little bit more mature. So what happens in this process is they undergo a two-step process. So we'll do 2A as your first process, and this is going to be positive selection. And what positive selection is the TCR must, okay, definitely a must, recognize and bind. So recognize and bind with MHC. Okay? So here, the naive T cell must be able to recognize and then bind with a specific, or bind with the MHC molecule. This is important because the ability to bind with the MHC is going to come in to another step we're talking about down the road, which is going to activate B cells. All right, so if at this point, if they are able to recognize and bind with an MHC platform, they can go on to the next phase. So they live. If they cannot bind with that receptor or they do not recognize the MHC, they die. They kill themselves, okay? So that's a pretty tough standard on this one. The next step, assuming they pass, then they go to the next step. We'll just call that 2B, and this is going to be negative selection. And what negative selection is where the T cell must not bind with self-antigens on an MHC platform. So here, must not bind, well, that's a with. C with a line above it, that's just a shortcut thing for with. Must not bind with a self-antigen on MHC platform, both type 1 and type 2. Okay, so here you have to, let me close this one out. I don't need that. So what we have to do on this one is first, for positive selection, we must, or the T cell must be able to recognize and bind with an MHC platform. Then the negative selection is we must let that T cell differentiate. That's not a good word I want on this because that's going to come next. Must be able to identify self-antigens. If it's unable to identify you, then it will bind you and cause something along the lines of an autoimmune disorder. Okay, so it has to bind and recognize with an MHC platform. Step 1. Step 2, it must not bind with self-antigens on a platform. Now this is usually done, or it's done, the MHC platform in this case are going to be on dendritic cells, because remember back in the innate we had a antigen presenting cell, APCs, which will present an MHC1 or 2 platform on those. So that's what you're doing. If you are unable to identify self, or you bind with a self-antigen, then you fail, and if you fail, you die. So if they pass this stage where they do not recognize or they ignore self-antigens, they are known as self-tolerant. Okay, so that's going to be self-tolerance. At this point, the next step, we are going to go to step 3, which is going to be differentiation, or they differentiate. Okay, and here they choose CD4 and CD8. Remember, going back to that top. Now, what those receptors are, CD4, remember, when they leave the bone marrow going to the thymus, they have a T cell receptor, the TCR, and both CD4 and CD8. After they go through positive and negative selection, now they must choose which one do you want. Do you want CD4 or do you want CD8? In both cases, they remain, or they continue to have the TCR. Okay, so a CD4, the ones that stay on the CD4 side, those end up being a helper T cell. That ends up to a helper T cell. CD8 on this one, so for CD8 on this one, that's going to be the cytotoxic or killer cell, killer T cell. Okay, at this point they are immunocompetent. Okay, so they're still naive, but they have functioning receptors on them. So now they're out on your system. They're in either lymph nodes or wherever they're going to go, and they have functioning receptors. Naive basically means they're immature and they have not been exposed to the antigen that they're sensitive for. Okay, so once they're exposed and ready to go and they become activated, then they are mature and no longer naive. Right now, they have active receptors. They are immunocompetent, but they are still naive. Now, out of this whole process that we've talked about, out of your initial thymocytes, go way back up here, your initial thymocytes that go to the thymus, out of all of those, 2% live, 98% die. Okay, I think I mentioned it in this class. This is basically like saying, okay, you're the student. As a student, you are naive. You haven't been fully exposed. You're not fully ready to go out into the world and take care of patients. Okay, this is why you're going to school. Well, if you were to be held at the same standard that T cells are being held at, this basically means if you do not pass every test with 100% accuracy, you kill yourself. And only 2% of you make it. So look around the room, although we're on video now, look around the room, and out of 100 students, only 2 of you survive. So that's pretty tough standards that we're looking at. So this is the specifics for selection and differentiation of T cells. Now the next video we're going to go in and we're going to look at how the humoral immune response is addressed, which is going to be the B cells. And then we're going to look at cell-mediated on how that immune response is activated. And then after that, we'll do another video and kind of put both of them together because they're not two separate. They are two separate pathways, but they interact with each other. So we'll do that on the flip side.